Situation right now is that there's contaminated water that's leaking out of the vessel. It's leaking under buildings, it's leaking out onto soil, onto plants, onto milk, into the ocean. The problem and significance of that is that the US gets imports of milk, produce, veggies, and pretty much all of milk produce from Japan, and we've put a temporary stop on that due to the radiation contamination. Some people say, scientists say that, it's not going to have a big effect, health risks are going to be down. People who haven't had risks of cancer and whatnot will not be affected, but others say that people who are hereditary and can get cancer, have a higher chance of getting cancer, will eventually get sick from the radiation. In this speech, I will inform you about how nuclear energy works, what exactly happens in a nuclear meltdown, the process of how that goes on, and eventually what is going on in Fukushima in Japan, and what they're doing right now to fix the problem. The Fukushima reactors are boiling water reactors. They have a grid, and in those, it's a pattern grid, and in that grid there are 13 rods that actually go into that grid in a sort of a circular pattern. And then there are also control rods that control the temperature and keep everything at equilibrium that go up towards into the grid, upwards, so that it keeps everything stable. That vessel's filled with water, and then when that uranium goes in, they're actual pellets. They're about 350 to 400 4-inch pellets of uranium-235. It's a special type of uranium that doesn't involve explosive material, so if anything does happen, it won't explode, it won't cause a nuclear bomb, if you want to call it that. The problem is that the nuclear rods that are inserted with pellets are surrounded by zirconium alloy, which melts at a certain temperature. The water begins to boil when those rods are inserted, and the splitting of atoms occurs. Splitting of atoms releases energy, and when that energy is given off, it's given off in the form of heat and radiation. The heat begins to boil the water travels up towards pipes into turbines. The turbines are steam generated, so they turn and spin, and eventually the generators get powered and electricity is given off. That's sort of how the plant actually works. The water is sent back, recycled, brought down to cool down, then sent back through an electric pump into the reactor to start the process all over again. In a nuclear meltdown, what happens is the rods begin to melt as the temperature goes up due to lack of water. When that lack of water hits, the zirconium alloy melts, temperature goes up above 2200 degrees, which is the normal temperature. When that happens, the actual uranium begins to melt with the alloy. The water, there is no water anymore at all. And it goes right through the basically 4 stages of protection. You have the vessel, you have the alloy surrounding it, you have the concrete, and eventually the outer building, which in Fukushima actually explodes. The steps of nuclear meltdown are starting here on the very left. You'll see that temperature rises, begins to rise. The red here is the uranium rods. The white and gray are the control rods, and as step 2 happens, temperature begins to actually go higher and higher, above 2200 degrees, and eventually melts through the vessel, through the reactor, right down to the bottom, and then you have the meltdown, which is the main problem. Japan's problem right now is that they're actually trying to control that from happening. Their main issue is the vessel, and they don't want that vessel to melt. If that vessel melts, then it's going to take an immense amount of time to clean out, years, which it already has due to the rods being exposed. When the rods are exposed, you already have decay heat, and decay heat lasts months and years, and radiation continues to flow off of that for years. If that meltdown actually happens and there were people within that 12-mile radius, 210,000 people, which an approximation, would die. That's a huge amount of people, and that's why it's so important to Japan that this does not happen. Their buildings actually exploded in Japan. The reason that happened is because when zirconium alloy that the rods, the protection around the rods melts. Then at that point, it produces hydrogen. The hydrogen comes up and builds up inside this vessel, and then it has nowhere to go. So it has to be released. There are a couple different theories about what exactly happens. The main one that's happened is that as the hydrogen built up, it was released through the vessel, and when combined with oxygen, it combines into sort of a combustion, an explosive material. It exploded, and out goes the first layer of protection, if you want to call it that. And then during the earthquake, you have all the reactors, they're working properly, and then they're shut down automatically when the slightest movement occurs. The control rods are fully inserted into the actual reactor, and then at that point, you have it starting to slow down the process of equilibrium. You won't have that movement, that splitting of atoms as much as it did before. It tries to bring that to a stop, even though you'll still have the heat going and the steam going due to the process that's been going on for quite a long time. That's brought up, and when the earthquake actually hits, you have electricity going out. You have the pumps which pump water into the reactor beginning to fully sort of subside. Steam goes up, and then you have no water, uranium rods are exposed. At that point, the second backup plan goes on, which is the diesel generators. Those diesel generators are powered off of diesel, and they work up to a certain point, which is when the whole tidal wave tsunami hit. It wasn't a plan. This reactor and this nuclear plant actually had backup plans, but what happened was when the tsunami hit, the diesel generators broke down. So here comes their third backup plan, which is the batteries, 8 hours of battery life. Diesel generators keep going for 8 hours, and then they come to a stop. At that point, they have no choice but to manually pump water into the actual reactors. They do that by helicopters, by fire trucks, whatever they could possibly do. And that's pretty much their situation at this point. Nuclear reactors in general are a great source of energy. They're clean, they're efficient, they don't produce any kind of methane or anything like that into the environment, unlike coal and other substances that the United States uses. Yes, we should have other backup plans, but if you look at Japan, that already had about 4 or 5 backup plans, and it withstood 7 times the amount of an earthquake that it's supposed to stand. A 9.0 and you got a 4.0 going on, it's just a whole difference of the amount of earthquake. It's a huge change. Right now, they're working on trying to bring down that radiation and that leaking that's going on. As of this morning, they are going to pump water into the ocean, all that contamination into the ocean. The results, they're not quite sure what the results are going to be, if that radiation will stay next to Japan or if it will spread. If it does spread, it will sort of continually to dissolve, if you want to call it that, because it's quite a vast amount of area. But at the same time, they're putting newspapers on top of buildings and where the contaminations are to bring sort of for it to absorb into it so that it doesn't continue to leak outside of these contaminated buildings and whatnot until the cleanup process can begin. Overall, nuclear energy is a great source of energy. It's a great source of electricity, and it's something that powers thousands and thousands of homes every day in the United States.